Alright, let's go ahead and begin your Week 6 lecture. This is also the beginning of Unit 2. Last week you guys took your first exam. I wanted to say that I'm very impressed with the exams overall. There are a few things I do want to address. One, I can see the IP address of which you guys submit them, and so there are some of the IP addresses that are similar, so that is just kind of a concern for me. I just want to make sure that you guys are holding up academic integrity, so keep that in mind when you submit your exams next time. But overall, overall I was impressed. Also, I will be adding the extra credit this week, so hopefully I'll have that updated by Tuesday, and you guys can see where your grade stands in addition to the extra credit. Just keep in mind that I add the extra credit to each subsequent exam for that unit. So all the extra credit from Unit 1 adds to your Unit 1 exam, and all the extra credit from Unit 2 adds to your Unit 2 exam, and so on. So just keep up the good work. You guys are obviously watching the lecture videos, which is very encouraging, and you guys are also doing a lot of the extra credit and so forth. So keep that up, and you guys should keep up the good grades that you guys have done so far. So let's go ahead and begin with the Texas Legislature. This is obviously going to be a new lecture for me, so we'll see how this goes. This is the first time that I've ever taught Texas government, and being from Kansas, this is also a whole new area for me as well. So let's go ahead and begin with the Texas Legislature. Let's go ahead and just talk about what a legislature does in general. There's different functions of every legislative body. Now, whether that be at the federal level or the state level, all legislative bodies tend to serve these four functions right here. Most importantly, they articulate the general demands of society. If society has a problem or it has something that needs to be taken care of, the legislative body is something that the society can turn to, and they can express their demands and their concerns to this legislative body. And the legislative body as a whole is supposed to articulate these general demands into one bill or one sort of action that takes care of the problem. Legislative bodies, whether that be Congress or state legislatures, also represent the needs of special segments of society, whether organized or unorganized. So when you look at demographics, maybe a particular race or ethnicity, or a particular sector of society such as veterans, they all need to be representative fairly by a legislative body. So legislative bodies tend to represent the needs of these special segments, whether it be a demographic or a particular interest groups, organized or unorganized. The legislative body needs to represent those needs and demands of those people. Third, legislative bodies are the ones that frame and give approval to laws. They are often active in drafting laws and debating through them, and then they also are the ones that vote on them by giving them approval or disapproval. Legislative bodies also allocate the resources of society, taxing and spending. We talked a lot about taxing and spending when we talked about federalism and how the federal government has the power to tax and spend. Well, a lot of state legislative bodies also have that as well. They have the power to tax and spend. Remember, that was a concurrent power under federalism. So state legislatures need to look at the tax revenue that is generated in the state and how to allocate those to schools, highways, and special events and things like that. How do we best manage the money that we've raised through the taxing and spending that we have done? Now, turning to the third point there, basis of representation, or I believe, sorry, actually it was the second point there. The basis of representation. They need to represent society in some sorts of way. How do we select them to be our representatives? Well, there's different types of districts, and there's also different types of constituencies. There's different types of districts. Now, typically we think of one representative per district. That's not always the way it has been done in Texas. In fact, in Texas, in the Texas House specifically, prior to the 1970s, we used to have multi-member districts. And what this meant is you would look at a district, and you would see how many people lived in this little kind of square box. We'll just use a square box for representation here. You would look at that, and then you'd say, so many people live within this box, they need this many members. So you may have 4 or 5 members representing one particular area, and particularly in urban areas. So they would draw Houston into one big district, and they said, the population is this big, Houston needs this many representatives. Same way with Austin and San Antonio and Dallas, those bigger urban areas. You may have many people representing the same constituency, the same district. So there might be 5 representatives in Houston, whereas maybe a smaller town in western Texas only has 1 person. per district. Nowadays, we use what are called single-member districts, and I can guarantee there'll be a question on your test between multi-member and single-member districts. And this is just the fact that you have one person per district, and you may split up larger urban areas into separate districts. So instead of having 5 people represent one district, now you have one person representing one district, but those districts are divided. And this is kind of the way the U.S. House works now. The U.S. House has single-member districts, one person per district, but you fragment the districts to allocate a particular amount of people into one district. So hopefully that makes sense between multi-member and single-member. It's just how many people represent one district. And multi-member means many people represent one district. Single-member means only one person represents one district. And like I said, in the rural areas prior to the 1970s, you tended to have a single-member district because less people lived out there. Whereas in the urban areas, you had multi-member districts because so many people lived within that one district. So those are the type of districts. Let's look at the type of constituencies. Constituencies really matter based on their demographics. Well, whether that be racial and ethnic makeup, economic makeup, religious makeup, or even just geographical. Geographical is the sole method for legal drafting of districts today. Although the way the districts are drawn can create homogeneous districts of a particular nature. So even though we only break up the districts based on demographic makeup, we may have it so that only one race or ethnicity is contained within that district. You can think of particular neighborhoods that may be of particular demographic makeup. Or you may have richer neighborhoods be in one district and poorer neighborhoods be in another district just based on the economic status of that district. So while we only base it on geography nowadays, the fact is that the way geography works often is that it also reflects the demographic makeup of that geographical district. So hopefully that makes sense. Constituencies really matter when you look at districts. You need to look at how the demographic makeup of that constituency may affect who they elect, and therefore that's why it's a basis of representation selection criteria, is that demographics may make up particular districts. Now, when you look at representatives themselves, representatives may have different kind of outlooks on how they should represent, and they kind of may look at what their role as a representative is. Now, most textbooks, and your textbook included, breaks it down into 3 little categories, and the 4th one here is just a combination of all 3. So the main 3 are a delegate. Some representatives may view themselves as a delegate, and when they are in the state legislature and they're voting, they vote as he or she believes the district wants. They say, hey, I'm a delegate of the people. The people elected me to be here. I'm going to vote as they want me to vote. So that's the role of a delegate. Now, others may be trustees, and that just means that, hey, they voted me here. They obviously think I'm smart enough. They think that I can reason for myself, that I know what's best for my district. So they're going to trust me to vote as they see me, So they vote consistent with their personal beliefs. They're a trustee. They voted me here so that they could trust my intuition and my reasoning for how I vote. So that's the trustee. The trustee doesn't look exactly how the district may want them to vote. They vote according to their beliefs because they believe that their beliefs reflect the people rather than maybe the other way around. Now, an advocate is just one who actually maybe a little bit corrupt. You can maybe draw that line there. But an advocate is definitely one that votes with the wishes of their major supporters and their contributors. So that's kind of why I said it might be corrupt, because maybe that could supporter or contributor may be a lobbying group or someone with a lot of power and influence. But if they're supporting me and contributing to me, that means that I should vote the way that they want me to vote, because they're the ones that have put me in this position to vote in the first place. So representatives may have different kind of outlooks on their role as a representative, and that's why often many of them are just considered politicos, which just means a combination of all 3 roles. Depending on the issue, they may vote as the delegate. Depending on other issues, they may vote as a trustee, and then maybe another issue, vote as an advocate. And in many ways, all 3 of these roles kind of combine to become a politician, to be honest with you, because that's kind of where you get the name politico. So roles of representatives can be very different based on the personality and the kind of political outlook of the representative itself. Now, given those different roles of representation, there's also different theories of representation. And I can guarantee that both of these will be on your test because they're very important ways to look at how representation should pan out. What does it mean to represent someone? And so what this really means is that should the legislative body reflect the population, or should it not matter, and the only thing that matters is that the representative does their job. And so there's this idea of sociological representation, and in sociological representation, demographics matter. So if you subscribe to the idea of sociological representation, you look at the demographics of the population. You look at the race, the gender, the class similarities, and maybe even the type of profession and so forth. And you say that if these sorts of demographics match the population at large, this means that the representative body is actually better at representing the interest of its people. So you want the demographics to represent the population at large. Even religious distribution should be close to the population at large. And even gender should also be close to the population at large. And in the Texas legislative body, the Texas state legislature, both the Senate and the House, you can see that sociological representation really isn't there. Most of the people that hold office in the Texas legislature are Caucasian, and it's a largely Protestant. It's also a largely Protestant body as well. Women really lag behind. Now, women make up around 50% of the population in Texas. However, in the state legislative body, there's only 37 women. That's 37 out of 180. And so it's not even close to that 50% that they are in the population at large. Same way with minorities. Minorities are underrepresented in the state legislative body as well. It has improved some. It currently stands at 38% overall. So that's not bad. We're close to 40%. However, when you look at Texas population at large, if you remember from previous lectures, Texas is a minority-majority state, meaning that the majority of the state is some sort of minority. Now, whether that be Black and African American, or Hispanic, or Asian American, or otherwise, all those minorities combined make up the majority of the population. However, when you look at the state legislative body, they only make up 38% of the state legislative body. So, in terms of sociological representation, Texas really lags behind. A lot of them tend to be in the law or business profession. They tend to be of Caucasian descent, and they're also Protestant or evangelicals otherwise. So sociologically, Texas kind of lags behind. Now, if you want to look at the full numbers and figures, I provided the link here, and this is for the 2013 legislative session. I couldn't get figures for the 2014 legislative session because in 2014 they had a very limited session. Now in 2015 they're going to have another session, and so they'll update these full facts and figures. But if you want to look at the full facts and figures of breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity and religion and so forth and gender, feel free to look at that. It's very, very interesting. But just do know that Texas is lagging behind in terms of sociological representation. Now that may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing, because on the flip side of that, there are also those that subscribe to agency representation. And what this says is, forget the statistics, forget the demographics. What matters is just representation. Members should spend their time on their casework, they should be good constituent servants, and they should vote as their constituents want. Legislatures inherently are not a sociological representation, or sociologically representative assembly. Sorry, let me say that again. Legislatures are not a sociologically representative assembly. What matters is that they're doing their jobs. The best agents, the best representatives, are not necessarily demographically correct. What matters is that they're doing their job, they're doing their casework, and they're being constituent servants. So, you can see there's a lot of merit to that as well. Now, whether you describe the sociological representation or agency representation, that's up to you. I'm just giving you the two theories behind what representation should mean. And I can guarantee there will be a question on your test about the difference between sociological representation and agency representation. So be sure to pay attention to that and know that what the difference between the two are. Now, here's how the Texas legislature breaks down. I already kind of gave you the demographics behind it. Let's just go ahead and look at the general structure of the Texas legislature. The Texas legislature is bicameral, and what I mean by that is that they have two houses, just like the federal government has two houses. The federal government has the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. Same way with the Texas legislature. They have a Senate and they also have a House. Now, obviously, Texas is on a lot smaller scale than the federal government. So in the Senate, we only have 31 members, and they're elected for 4-year terms, but they're overlapping terms. So half are elected 1 year, and then 2 years later, their other colleagues, the other half, are elected. And then in 4 years, they're up for re-election. So every 2 years, we elect a certain amount of senators, roughly 15 senators every 2 years. But your particular senator is only up every 4 years. So I hope that makes sense. They have overlapping terms. If you have questions about that, please send them my way. But for the House, you have 150 members, and they're elected for 2-year terms. All members run at the same time. All 150 are up for re-election every 2 years. So they're consistently campaigning. They're consistently engaged in the community because they need to be really active politicians because their term is a lot shorter. They need to get stuff done, and they need to ensure that they're doing the right thing to get reelected in another 2 years. Now, the Texas legislature, they have particular sessions, and Texas has a really unique state legislature because they only meet every 2 years, and they only meet for 140 days every 2 years. That's not a lot. That is a lot. That's a really short time to try to get a lot done. To try to govern the second largest state in the union in 142 days every 2 years, you're consistently busy. They are consistently doing things on a constant basis. Now, they may have special sessions. Special sessions, if maybe they didn't get things done in this 140 days, the governor can call a special session to try to extend the legislature to try to get things done. And these special sessions last 30 days whenever called by the governor. If something needs to be done in an even number year, because remember, they only meet in odd years, if something needs to be done in an even year, the governor may call a special session to say, hey, we need to really focus on this, we need to get this done because you guys couldn't get it done in your regular session. Or maybe it's a new problem that arose that the governor needs to try to get done as well. So the sessions are only, if barring special sessions, the regular sessions are only 140 days every 2 years. Think about how much has to be done, how busy they have to be at work to try to get everything done for the second largest state in the union in 140 days. I won't say it's ridiculous, but it is quite a bit to try to get all that stuff done once every 2 years. Now, the reason for this is the way that the Texas legislature is organized. And we're going to go ahead and talk about organizational issues for legislative bodies. The organizational issues revolve around the level of professionalism and also the degree of partisan organization. So let's go ahead and talk about the level of professionalization right now. There are different models of legislative organization. There's a citizen legislature and there's a professional legislature. What Texas has is a citizen legislature. So let's go ahead and deal with this left-hand column right here. With a citizen legislature, you have a low pay. And the reason for this is because you don't want your representatives to be professional legislatures. You don't want them to rely on the money. You want them to also be able to hold a job elsewhere, to go home, serve their constituents, things like that. You don't want it to be a full-time job. So citizen legislatures tend to have low pay. They have limited length sessions. We already talked about that with the Texas legislature. Only 140 days every 2 years. It's very, very limited length session. And they also have limited staffing. There's not many people to help out the members of the legislature. There's not a lot of people to conduct the business and so forth. So this is how Texas breaks down. Texas, concerning low pay, they only have $7,200, and that's their yearly salary. So they get paid only $7,200 a year. Not very much when you consider the salaries of Congress and the salaries of other state legislatures. Like I said, they meet 140 days every 2 years, very limited length sessions. And their staff, limited staffing. It's set at a fixed number. I forget the exact number. It's on the Texas Legislative website if you want to look that up. But very, very limited staff members. You have a fixed number, and that's for people from Houston who have to deal with a large amount of constituents, and also for the same amount, and the people from West Texas who have to deal with less constituents. They all have the same fixed number of staff. So you can see how it's kind of difficult to get things done if you have a limited staff to help you out. Now, in contrast to a citizen legislature, in contrast to a citizen legislature, other states have a professional legislature. Now, that means that they have full-time members. That is their job. That is their job, to be there, to legislate, to conduct business, and to get things moving on the agenda and things like that. There's no limits on the session. It's a professional job, so anytime during the business hours, you can go ahead and you'll be there as a member of the state legislature. They have adequate staffing also. They tend to, because they're professional, because they're there full time, they need to have a good staff. So the example of this would be California. Now, California is the largest state in terms of population, and because they have such a large state, they felt that they needed a professional legislature. Whereas Texas, the second most populous state, didn't feel that they needed a professional legislature, and instead went with a citizen legislature. So let's look at California. California, they're, in contrast to Texas, they get paid a pretty nice sum, $95,291. That's not bad. That's actually a really, really good salary. And they're in session from December to September. So they're on for 9 months of the year. They're there for 9 months of the year. They're only here for the equivalent, maybe, of 3 months, about 4 months every 2 years. 4 months every 2 years. They're there 9 months every year. And in terms of staffing, it's as needed. If you need to hire a new staffer, you can. If you need someone to investigate a particular issue for you, you can. So it's as needed in California in terms of staffing. So you can kind of see the difference between a citizen legislature and a professional legislature. And this is there's kind of been talk about whether Texas should move to a professional legislature, because not a lot is getting done in this 140 days. And we're going to watch a video here of how difficult it is to get stuff done in 140 days. And also the fact that they have limited staffing and low pay, when really maybe we should make them more responsible, or maybe pay them a little bit more so that it kind of deters them from taking money from elsewhere as well. That's kind of another pro and con to think about. And particularly think about that when you answer your discussion board question this week, and hopefully you can weigh a little bit about the pros and cons between the citizen legislature and a professional legislature. But moving on, let's also talk about the partisanship also. There's particular legislatures that are partisan, and then there's also nonpartisan. Texas has a partisan legislature, and what that means is everything is organized by parties. Parties are responsible for the selection of the leadership, of the committees, and of the staffing. So what that means is if Republicans hold the majority in the state legislature, you're probably going to, and if Republicans hold the majority in the state legislature and you're a Republican, you're probably going to get a better chance at a leadership position, you're going to get better committees, and you're also going to get better staffing because you're a member of a particular party that's responsible for the selection of these things. Other state legislatures say, let's move beyond party lines. Let's go with a non-party organization. And what that means is that parties play only a limited role in these things. Parties don't select the leadership. Leadership is based off of merit. Parties don't appoint committees. Committees are based on whether you're specialized in that area or whether you know a lot about that area. And also your staff and legislative agencies are also nonpartisan as well. So the party doesn't play as big of a role. Instead, it's all about your credentials, your merit, your resume, and that determines whether you get a leadership or a particular committee chair position and things like that. So nonpartisan organizations tend to be a lot more collegial, and they get things done a lot quicker. So those are things to consider as well. Now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the Texas legislature itself. Now whether you think they should be professional or just a citizen legislature, whether you think they should be partisan or nonpartisan, that's up to you. That's your opinion, and there's a discussion board question that will allow you to talk about that just a little bit. But in terms of the Texas legislature itself, it is a citizen legislature, and so therefore the salary is really, really low. We already talked a little bit about that, but it is set by the Texas Constitution at $7,200 a year, $7,200 a year. So that's not a whole lot. They do get a little per diem to help out. The per diem is set at $150 per day, and this is set annually by the Texas Ethics Commission. The Texas Ethics Commission is part of the legislative body, and they're the ones that decide based on inflation and costs and things like that how much the Texas legislature should be paid per day. Now, when you think about $150 a day, that's not bad, right? But you also got to factor in maybe hotel costs, food costs, and paying your staff as well, things like that. So there's travel. They do get paid for travel. You get paid the same mileage rates as other state employees, particularly when on legislative business. And you also have a nice retirement fund. The retirement fund isn't all that great, but it's not bad. So you get paid if you have at least 12 years of service. It's calculated on 2.3% times your years of service times the salary of a district judge. So you look at the district judge in your area, how much do they get paid? Then you times that by your years of service, and then you times that by 2.3%. Hopefully, I'm not really going to ask you about that formula or anything, but overall, the retirement fund really isn't that bad, particularly if you've had 12 years of service, which isn't that long. You get a decent retirement fund as well. So this is all part of being a citizen legislature. It's not overwhelming. It's not the $95,000 that you would make in California, but it is a little bit better than nothing, I suppose. Your duties as a legislature, though, or as a legislative member, is just first and foremost to pass laws. You have a legislative duty to pass laws. The legislature is also important in amending the Constitution. They propose the amendments by 2/3 of vote of both chambers. And remember, as soon as it's passed by the 2/3 vote in both chambers, then it goes on to the people to approve it. When we talked about the amendments on the discussion board, you guys found a lot of really good ones, so keep that up. That was really encouraging. But just know that the legislature is the one that originates those proposals and then passes them on to the people to approve as well. The legislature also serves an electoral function, and what I mean by that is they're the ones that hold the regular elections. They get people informed about what's going on. Elections are a great place to exchange information about what's going on in Austin and what's going on in the Texas government. And also they help out their constituents as well. Not only do they provide information, but they also help them out with casework and things like that. They also serve direct and supervisory functions as well, so they perform audits, and they kind of going along with this last one here, they investigate as well. They serve an investigation function, so they supervise everything. If something goes wrong, they can investigate it. If there's a particular deal with maybe corruption or a particular economic sector that's struggling, they can serve as an investigator into why that stuff is happening. And also legislatures can deal in impeachment. Now that's very, very rare here in Texas to impeach a governor, particularly because the state legislature is usually of the same party as the governor. So impeachment is also very, very rare. But if the case arose, the legislature is responsible for doing that as well. They do have particular non-constitutional duties as well, things that aren't in the Constitution. Services for constituents. So if you're having a problem with maybe some bureaucracy or some red tape that's going on, the legislature can step in and help you do that as well. They perform oversight through staff and their committees. Like I said, they oversee everything. And they also conduct research through staff and committees. They want to research how the oil industry is doing or how the agriculture industry is doing. How are the stock prices of oil going to affect the Texas economy and things like that. They do a lot of research. They're really well versed on the issues because those issues are important to the constituents. They want to be able to relay that information back and also to vote accordingly on laws based on that research as well. So this is really where you got to remember we talked about empirical and normative political science. This is really where it comes to fruition right here with the legislatures. They're the ones that research the data and statistics, but they're also the one that thinks about what's best for their constituents, what philosophically is best in terms of justice and fairness and virtue and all those sorts of things as well. So that's where the legislatures really engage in political science, whether they realize it or not. And those are all non-constitutional duties. Now, the Texas legislature does have leadership to it as well. These are the presiding officers of the Texas legislature. In the House, you have the Speaker. Just like in the federal government, where you have the Speaker of the House in the federal government, you also have a Speaker of the House in the Texas government as well. And that's Joe Strauss. And he's elected by the members of the House. So every new session, the House will vote on who should be the Speaker of the House for that legislative session. Joe Strauss, I provided the link to his website right here. If you're interested in his leadership and what his priorities are and things like that, he is the Speaker of the House for this last term and probably will be since the Republicans maintain the hold on the House of Representatives in Texas. There's also a Speaker Pro Tem. This is kind of just secondary to the Speaker of the House itself, and it's Dennis Bonnen. If you want to look up his website, I've also provided the link right there as well. He's just appointed by the Speaker. The Speaker can delegate some duties to him, and he doesn't really have anything formal to do, but he does kind of organize things within the House as well. There's other officers appointed by the Speaker. If you want a full list, I'm going to provide a link to that here in just a little bit. Now flipping to the Senate, and the Senate you have the Lieutenant Governor. And it's very interesting because the Lieutenant Governor is second in line to the Governor. So if there was a vacancy in the Governor, the Lieutenant Governor would step up. And it's the same way at the federal level as well. In the federal level, the Vice President is the President of the Senate. So Texas kind of mirrored the federal government in saying that the Lieutenant Governor is the President of the Senate in Texas as well. And so Lieutenant Governor is obviously elected by the voters, just like the Vice President is elected by the voters. Lieutenant Governor oversees the Senate, just as the Vice President oversees the Senate. The current Lieutenant Governor is Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick has a very interesting story. He's kind of a political underdog in many ways, and so Dan Patrick has run for a number of offices, and I guess he finally found his winning formula in being Lieutenant Governor. So Dan Patrick, fascinating guy. If you want to read up on him for sure. President Pro Tem. President Pro Tem is elected by the Senator instead of being appointed by the Speaker. He's elected by the Senate. And seniority is a major factor here. The President Pro Tem is often the oldest serving senator. So the longer you've been there, the older you are, and the longer you've been there, usually allows you to be President Pro Tem. He's elected by his colleagues because he's been there the longest based on seniority. And it's, excuse me if I butcher this name, it's currently Juan Hinojosa. Sorry, once again, sorry if I butchered that name. But he's currently the President Pro Tem, and I believe he's been in the Senate since the 70s or the early 80s. I've provided his link here also, if you're interested. And there's also different Senate officers, just like in the House as well. So these are your presiding officers. I'm not going to ask you particularly who they are, but I will ask you maybe who is the leader of the House and who's the President of the Senate and things like that. So be aware of that for your test. Powers of the presiding officers, well, they have quite a few actually. They have the 6 that are listed here. They appoint all committees. So the Speaker of the House and also the President of the Senate, they get to appoint all the committees. Now, whether that be a standing, a special, or an interim committee, they are the ones that get to appoint who gets what committee position. The presiding officers also refer bills to the committee, meaning that if there's a bill that they feel needs to really be debated in committee, they can say this bill goes to this committee, this bill goes to this committee. They approve appointment of all employees. Any state employee that serves the legislative body, they have to be appointed. They have to be appointed by someone, and then the presiding officer has to approve that appointment of that state employee to serve the legislative branch. That's not all state employees. That's just ones that serve the legislative branch, in particular the staff and things like that. Presiding officers also organize the calendar for legislative action, so they're the ones that schedule the debate, when and how we're going to debate this. They recognize speakers, so if someone wants to speak on a particular issue, the presiding officer has to give them permission to speak. If you don't get the favor of the presiding officer to speak, then it's a little difficult to be able to engage in the debate. And they also rule on points of order. If there's a particular points of order, if there's misconduct or things like that, then the presiding officer also kind of rules on that as well. So the presiding officer has a lot of power. Whether you're in the House or the Senate, they do have a lot of power, and they really kind of make sure all the business is being conducted in a formal manner in the legislative body, in the state legislature. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about committees. Committees are really important because committees are really kind of the backbone of the entire legislative process. Most of the work in state legislatures or legislative bodies gets done in committee. Now, there's different types of committee. There's a standing committee, a special committee, an interim committee, and a statutory committee. A standing committee just means that it is standing. Duh. It's standing, which means that it's permanent. It deals with a particular issue that is deemed important enough to have a standing committee for it. Membership is established at the beginning of a session. Special committees or investigatory commissions, sorry, I just butchered that as well. Special committees are created with a special mandate. So if something comes up, if there's maybe a scandal or there's a big issue with a particular sector of society or sector of the economy or things like that, this investigatory committee will investigate that issue. Interim is just kind of a study committee in between terms. So they operate during the interim only if it's an issue that needs to be studied so that it can be brought up for debate during the regular session. Then this interim committee can weigh on that issue, provide updated facts to the new session, and make sure that the debate goes on there. Now, statutory committees are ones that are established by law. These include the Legislative Budget Board. We need a budget board, so they establish that by law. A Legislative Council, which oversees all the business, and then the Legislative Audit Committee, which oversees the taxing and spending of the state itself. So these are committees deemed enough to be important to have a law that establishes them, and therefore they are permanent. So let's go ahead and talk about legislative staff. Legislative staff are really, really important. Now, we talked about how a citizen legislature has a limited staff. Well, they're very limited, but they're still very important to the whole process itself. So for your session staff, this is a staff that you have during a regular session, the Senate and the House kind of vary. The Senate has a variable allowance set by the Senate Administration Committee for each senator. So if you're a senator with a lot of constituents and you need a lot of staff members, you can kind of petition the Senate Administration Committee to allow you to have a few more. It's a variable. And if the Senate Administration Committee allows you to have more staff members, then you can have them. The House, there's a fixed allowance for each House member for staff and office expenses. So there's a fixed number, and like I said, I don't have the exact fixed number on me right now, but the House does have a fixed allowance for each House member, and each House member has that fixed allowance regardless of how many constituents they represent. Now, office expenses can vary. In the Senate, it has to be within reasonable expenses. Now, it's quote unquote. So if you expend an extravagant amount, a lavish amount of money on office expenses, then you're probably going to be called up under investigation. However, it's reasonable, you stay within budget, it's not too bad, then you're okay. The House, their office expenses are just part of the overall allowance. So there's an overall allowance, and then if the House exceeds that, then they get called into investigation. In the interim, you have the same arrangement, but reduced amounts. Obviously, it's the interim. We're not debating anything. The session's over. Right now, we're just doing research and making political connections and things like that. So you have the same arrangement, but obviously reduced amounts in the interim. All right, so back to committees. The staff is obviously important because they serve the committees and things like that. But here are the standing committees. In the Senate, you have 21 standing committees. 3 are not substantive committees. You have the administration, the committee of the whole Senate, and then the nominations committee. Those are not substantive committees. The other 18 committees tend to deal with a particular issue. Now, whether that be transportation, commerce, maybe the budget committee, agriculture committee, trying to think of a few other committees. But those, what I mean by substantive is that they deal with a particular issue that is pertinent to the population. So these 3 are not substantive committees, the other 18 are. They deal with a particular issue. Now in the House, you have 39 standing committees. The House deals on a more personal level with constituents, so therefore they're going to have more standing committees because those issues really matter. Now 5 of these are just simply procedural committees that just set the rules, it's for debate and things like that. Those are the Calendars Committee, they set the schedule. General Investigations and Ethics, if anything arises in terms of ethical standards, or there may be a scandal or something going on, that committee will handle that. There's House Administration. Once again, they just oversee the day-to-day functions. Local and Consent Committee, so they deal with local issues. And then Rules and Resolutions, they set the rules for debate for each bill. The other 34 standing committees deal with a particular issue area, just like I said, transportation, agriculture, things like that. If you want the full list of standing committees, I've provided the link here. You can go ahead and click on that, look up all the committees. and maybe even see what your own representatives are on in terms of committees. Statutory committees, these are the ones that are set up by law. I'm not going to go over them in great detail, but you have the Legislative Budget Board, you have the Legislative Council, and you have the Legislative Audit Committee. If you're interested in them in any way, I provided the links for them as well. But they're the ones that deal with most of the finances and the administration and things like that. Now, it's also very unique because you do have the House of Representatives and you also have the Senate. But there's also a legislative role of the governor. We also cannot ignore the governor. He has a huge role and a huge say in what goes on in the state legislatures, or the state legislature in Texas at least. So legislative role of the governor, they declare legislative emergencies. Remember, the governor can call those special sessions. If there's a legislative emergency, if something needs to be handled at this exact moment, the governor can go ahead and call a legislative emergency or call those special sessions to try to get it handled. The governor also addresses the legislature. There's often a State of the State address, which I guess Governor Perry did, but I guess now it's Greg Abbott. I about said Rick Perry. He was the former governor. Now it's Greg Abbott. He addresses the legislature. He delivers a State of the State address, and he just kind of, much like the State of the Union, he addresses the legislative body and tells them what's going on in the state of Texas. The calling special sessions kind of goes hand in hand with the declaring legislative emergencies. And so those calling special sessions kind of usually deal with those sorts of things. The governor also vetoes legislation. The veto legislation is a huge legislative role of the governor, as well as the president on the federal level. Vetoing legislation is a huge role of the governor because it kind of maybe shows his disapproval of a bill, or maybe it kind of calls out the legislative branch for, hurrying along a bill, or maybe something like that. Maybe something that went against the interests of the people in general. Now, there are legislative reforms, and these are proposals that are generally proposed by, as I put on here, experts. There's maybe things that we need to think about with the Texas legislature. One, the Texas legislature doesn't meet very often, and so they can't really get a whole lot done. So maybe we should reform it to have full-time legislatures. Maybe we need to reform the legislature to have better informational services. And what I mean by that is that even though they have this interim period, they don't really maybe do a whole lot of research. And so maybe we need to provide better channels for information to flow freely. And maybe we could do that with a professional legislator. Because professional legislatures, their whole duty is to be versed on the topics and to be there for their constituents and to do that research and things like that. Also, some people may call for improved mechanics in terms of the rules, the role of the presiding officers, and limits on local and special legislation, and also lobbying control. So the mechanics, the kind of the cogs in the machine that make the wheels turn, maybe we need to rethink those cogs and think about how we can improve the legislation by adjusting the rules, or maybe the lobbying industry, or things like that. So all these are just kind of things to think about of maybe ways we could reform the Texas legislature in one way or another. Now, the main steps of the legislative process in Texas generally follow these steps. Now, it's not all as clean and nice as it's laid out in here, because there's a lot of backdoor negotiation, there's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of politics in general, I'll just say that much. But in general, to pass a bill in Texas, it follows these steps. First, you need to draft the proposals. You need to draft what this bill is going to deal with. You need to lay it out in a nice outline. You need to submit it to a committee. So after you draft the proposal, you have an introduction and referral. The bill is introduced to the floor, and then it's assigned to a committee. Now, remember, the Speaker of the House is usually the one that gets to assign it to a particular committee. So this is the introduction and referral. He'll introduce the bill, he'll maybe read out the proposal, and then he'll send it to a committee, and in the committee, most of the work gets done. And this is the third step here, the committee actions. In the committee, you have a lot of debate. The legislators will debate with one another, they'll hash it out, they'll draft and redraft and draft again the bill until it's laid out into a nice bill that can be considered good enough for the fourth step here, floor consideration. Now, it's also worth it to note in committee action, that's where a lot of the politicking goes on. If it passes committee, though, the floor consideration, it gets to the floor, there's a nice debate, and maybe it'll get passed. Under the floor consideration, it usually is voted on. Now, whether it passes or not, that depends on the bill itself. But if passes floor consideration and debate, and it is approved, then it may go to a conference committee. Note I have this little star here, means it may or may not happen. These actions do not occur on every bill. Let me explain a conference committee real quick. A conference committee is when the House passes a version of the bill, and then the Senate passes a version of the bill, but they may not be the exact same version. The Texas Constitution requires them to be identical versions of the bill. They have to be identical. Now, maybe the House version of the bill is not the same as the Senate version of the bill, so they'll call a conference committee in which House members and senators will talk with one another, debate it out, and iron out the differences between the two bills. That's what a conference committee is. It's a conference of both House members and Senate members to try to kind of hash out the differences between the bill, so that way it's identical, and then it can pass both the House and the Senate being identical, and then it can go to the governor. And that's where the governor action comes in. He can either veto the bill or sign the bill, and it becomes a law if he approves it. It goes back to the legislative body if he vetoes it, and that's where the last step comes in. Let's say he vetoed it. You may have an override of the veto. Remember, this may not occur because the governor does not veto every piece of legislation. But if he does veto a piece of legislation, it can go back to the legislature to try to override the veto. So while that was kind of a nice little 7-step process there, very simplistic terms, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. A lot of debate, a lot of politicking, a lot of compromise, and just a lot of hours go into really trying to get a bill passed. And I would say pretty much anywhere. All government bodies really kind of have a lot of politicking and things going on. But definitely in Texas, and definitely at the national level for sure. So let's go ahead and talk about the difference between bills and resolutions and things like that. So the bills is kind of what we laid out with this little process here. We kind of laid out the process for a bill. Now you can have a House bill, which is often designated as HB, or you can have a Senate bill, which is designated as SB. And it all depends on where the bill originates. If it originates in the House, it's an HB. If it originates in the Senate, it's an SB. Now a bill is really supposed to just establish or amend laws. And also, bills also are responsible for appropriating money. So bills have to be passed by both houses in the same form and signed by the governor. Remember, they have to have identical versions. But that's really all a bill does, is that it establishes or amends laws, and it also appropriates money. That's all a bill does. Now, on the other hand, you can have resolutions. Resolutions, you can have an HJR or an SJR. I hope you know the difference between the two there. The joint resolutions, really, all they're meant to do is propose constitutional amendments. So remember, they propose constitutional amendments, they're approved by 2/3 of both houses, and then they're voted on by the people. That's a joint resolution. And then you can have a concurrent resolution. If there's something that needs to be done in the House and the Senate, a concurrent resolution is a way to get that done. It has to pass through both the House and the Senate, and the concurrent resolution is binding. After it's passed in the House and Senate, it doesn't go to a vote by the people. So a concurrent resolution deals with a particular issue and is passed by the House and the Senate, and it's concrete there. So it doesn't have the status of law, but it is a resolution to kind of change the way business is conducted. Simple resolutions, kind of the same thing. They don't really deal with large issues, and they don't establish a law. There's just maybe something minor that we really need to kind of deal with. So I probably won't put an exact question about the difference between bills and resolutions on your test, but hopefully that did make sense. And if you have any questions, please send them my way. All right, the drafting of bills, the very beginning of bills, I guess. I just kind of want you to know the major sources of legislative proposals. These are the main 4 places where bills kind of come out of. Then the very first one here is interest groups. If you have a particular interest group, however loosely organized, they can try to get together a draft of a bill. So it can be something that's so obscure as maybe like a gun rights interest group, or maybe like a sportsman's club, something like that. Some weird interest group. It can be really obscure, but they can still kind of draft bills, and they can reach out to their legislator, their members of the House, their members of the Senate, and say, hey, we really need to draft this bill. The executive branch, agencies of the executive branch, the governor. they're responsible for drafting bills as well, along with interest groups. There's also legislative staff and committees, the budget board, the council, the standing committees, the interim committees. Committees are responsible for drafting bills as well. They're the ones that are well versed in the issue. They specialize in that issue. They know about that issue. Why wouldn't they draft bills? Individual members as well. Individual members, and what I mean by that is members within the House and the Senate, they can also draft their own bills. If they feel that the issue is important enough, that they really need this addressed for their constituents, or they really need to address this because of their own personal beliefs or otherwise, they can also draft bills. So interest groups can introduce bills, agencies of the executive branch, committees, and also individual members. All of these are major sources of legislative proposals. All of these have a say in drafting bills. No matter how large or small, they can all draft bills and submit it to the floor or submit it to the speaker to then assign to committee and so forth. So hopefully that made sense. We'll go this way here. All right. So as soon as it's drafted, introduction and referral. Introduced by members only. So if you're going back one slide, if you're an interest group trying to draft a bill, you need to give it to a particular member of the House or the Senate. Bills and resolutions can only be introduced by members of the House or the Senate. They have to be filed with the Secretary of the Senate or the Clerk of the House. The Secretary of the Senate or the Clerk of the House really are kind of the ones that organize all the bills that are given to them, and then they'll give it to the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate, and then they will give out the bills to the committee. So then it's referred to committee. Once again, it's referred by a presiding officer on the recommendation of a parliamentarian. So the presiding officer, whether that be the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate, they refer it to a committee. And each House can override the presiding officer by majority vote. If a majority of the House or a majority of the Senate does not believe that that bill is actually good enough to be in committee, they can override that presiding officer. It's very rarely done. They tend to trust the presiding officer that they know what they're doing, and they kind of feel like the bill's going to die in committee anyway, because remember, the committee, there's a lot of politicking. If they feel like it's going to die in committee anyway, they just usually don't bother all that much. Let's say it passes through committee. Then you have floor consideration. And in the House of Representatives, you have what's called a calendar committee. I kind of already touched on this just a little bit. But the calendar committee, they're the ones that set the agenda. They're the ones that set what they're going to talk about for the day. And so that's why for floor consideration, it has to pass through the calendar committee, and the calendar committee has to put it on the schedule. You have a general calendar committee, and then you have a local and uncontested committee. Now in the Senate, it's just a little bit different. In the Senate, you have no calendar committee. You just have an agenda. And let's say you get done debating this bill. Well, then what's next on the agenda? Or let's say that particular bill took a long time. Maybe we can kind of X this from the agenda as well. So the Senate is kind of a lot more relaxed. They just kind of go with the flow. Whatever's on the agenda, then we'll talk about that next. If we don't have time for it, then forget it. We'll move on to the next agenda item and things like that. Whereas the House of Representatives, because of this calendar committee, they have a limited time to debate it. They don't have, and if you don't get your say in before that time is up, well, then you're out of luck. So the calendar committee and the House of Representatives is much more scheduled. The Senate is a lot more collegial and a lot more relaxed, and they just kind of stick to the agenda and go with the flow. In terms of floor debate, you have very little debate because you have 140 days to try to get through everything. You don't have a lot of time for debate. There's little time for lengthy debate anywhere. Also, because you only have 140 days, you have so many people scrambling to do so many things that very rarely are all members present in the chamber. Sometimes those members are in committee. They really have this push to get through the agenda. Maybe sometimes they're dealing with things back in their office and things like that. So very rarely are all members present because all members have 140 days and they're go, trying to get everything done. That's why a citizen legislature is sometimes so chaotic, and it really contributes very rarely meaningfully to the debate. And voting, when it does happen, can be chaotic. And I'm going to go ahead and post this button pushing link. I really need you to watch that. The reason why is because I want you to get an idea of how the Texas legislature votes. When an issue does come up, how do they vote? Because keep in mind, very rarely are members all in the chamber, so how do they count all the votes of all the members? And so this button pushing will give you an idea of really what goes on behind the scenes at the Texas Legislature. And there's a discussion board about this video on this week's discussion board, so be sure to watch this video before you answer that question. Now moving on, so it gets past committee, it gets past referral, it gets past committee, it gets past the floor debate. Then there's the governor's action. The governor, unlike the president, only really has two options, or maybe even three. So the governor has 10 days to either sign the bill or veto the bill. That seems rather straightforward. He can sign it, it becomes a law, or he can veto it, and it gets sent back to the state legislature. However, there is, just like with the president, there is this nice little 10-day window here. So after 10 days, if he doesn't sign it, it becomes a law without the governor's signature. So that's within 10 days, and that's if the state legislature is in session. If the bill is received during the last 10 days of the session, governor has 20 days to decide what to do. So during the last 10 days of the session, the governor has 20 days to decide what to do. And if he doesn't sign it after that 20 days, it doesn't become a law. So much like the president of the United States, the governor has very similar options as well. The governor has 10 days to either sign the bill or veto the bill, and after 10 days, it becomes law without the governor's signature if the legislature is in session. And if the bill is received within the last 10 days of the session, the governor has 20 days to decide what to do. So there's a number of ways the bill can become a law, or the bill cannot, or can be vetoed in either a outright or kind of a passive sort of manner. So hopefully that makes sense. If there's questions about that as well, please let me know. But if you're in my federal government class, you can also kind of compare it to what I said about what the president can do as well. The governor's actions are very, very similar to what the president can do to a bill. Now, let's say he vetoes it. There is such thing as an override of the veto. However, it is extremely rare. This has only happened twice in the last 50 years. Only twice in the last 50 years has a governor vetoed a bill and then the legislature overrode it. Now, there's two reasons for this. One, the governor and the state legislature often are of the same party. So if the state legislature overrides a veto, then you kind of have to sense that something is wrong between the governor and the state legislature in terms of their goals for the state and in terms of their party or maybe even their political ideology. The other reason why it's extremely rare is because they only meet every 2 years for 140 days. And so they don't really have they're trying to get so much done that they don't really even care that the governor vetoed it. They're just trying to move on to the next thing and get it done within that 140-day frame. So there's either political reasons or just organizational reasons why the override is so extremely rare. But if the state legislature was to override it, it would require a 2/3 vote of both houses. Very, very similar to the way the United States Congress organizes itself as well. So the override of the veto is very, very rare. So we kind of went through all the steps. We kind of broke it down bit by bit. If there's any questions over the entire process, please let me know. I know it was a lot of information to try to get through in a short while, but it does kind of seem like a very simple process when it's actually really, really complicated. So I'm gonna post that button pushing video, and this will kind of lead you to your discussion board questions. So number one, we talked a lot about the pros and cons of a citizen legislature versus the professional legislature. I want you to weigh the pros and cons for me. Lay it out in a paragraph or so, and then tell me: would you like to see Texas change its format, or do you like the way it is? Things to consider. Consider session lengths. Consider the agenda, whether they can move through the agenda. Consider salary. Would you like to see them have a higher salary or not? And also consider the level of responsibility that they have to their constituents. There are pros and cons to both a citizen legislature and a professional legislature. Weigh those out for me. Give me a paragraph or so, and then tell me what you would like to see it changed or not. And then give me justification for why you would like to see it changed or not. Second one, post your reaction to the button pushing video. I really want you to watch this button pushing video and tell me what you think of it. Do you think it's okay for the legislature to vote for other members? Should they be held responsible? Is this a result of having a citizen legislature or a limited agenda? Why or why not? And then, so watch the button pushing video, tell me if you think it's okay, and then kind of tell me whether you think it's a result of the citizen legislature or not. And then finally, post your Texas state representatives, both your House member and your senator. I want you to figure out who your representatives are. There was already an extra credit on this, so if you did that extra credit, you're good to go. And then tell me what committees they serve on and what their general platform and objectives are. I really want you to tell me what committees they serve on, because I really want to know if maybe that committee is related to an issue in your area, or maybe it's just a committee that they really wanted to be a part of. And then tell me what their general platform and objectives are. You don't have to go in full length. Just maybe give me like a little excerpt from their website or something like that. So, and maybe you can tell me what party or ideology they are as well. So you can kind of get a sense of that from their website as well. I'm just very interested if you can figure out who your Texas state representatives are, because not a lot of people think about their state representatives, when really they are a very important part to the whole system of government overall. So, all right, those are your discussion board questions. I will post all the links here just shortly. But next week we're going to talk about the Texas government. We're going to talk about Texas government. We're going to talk about the Texas governor in specifically. So I will talk to you then. Have a good week.